When the store manager finally apologized to me, I already understood everything I needed to know about that place. My name hardly matters now. I'm between 50 and 70 years old, depending on who asks. What matters is that, on that day, I walked into one of the city's most expensive luxury stores dressed the way I always dress. Simple, comfortable, with no visible brands, nothing that screamed who I am or what I own. As soon as I walked through the glass door, I felt it. It wasn't a word. It was a look. The attendant looked me up and down in less than 2 seconds. There was no genuine smile. There was no warm good morning. There was distance. He continued fiddling with his phone for a few moments as if I wasn't there. Then, he vaguely pointed to a corner of the store and said, curtly, that I could take a look, without moving, without offering help, without interest. Meanwhile, a well-dressed couple entered right behind me. Expensive clothes, shining watches, strong cologne. The same attendant changed his demeanor instantly. Broad smile, cheerful voice, total attention. Can I help you? We have some amazing news today. I watched everything in silence, not out of shyness, not out of fear, but because I had already lived through that scene before. Many times, the service I received was rushed, almost impatient. Short answers, no detailed explanations, no real attempt to sell. At times, I felt as if my presence was disrupting his day. And yet, I remained there, calm, alert. It wasn't the first time I'd been judged by my appearance, and I knew exactly why. My simple clothes didn't match that environment. My discreet manner didn't fit that mold. And to them, that said it all. What they didn't know was that those clothes hid a long story. A story built on hard work, setbacks, humiliations, and silent victories. That day, I didn't go into that store just to buy a luxury item. I went in to observe. And without realizing it, they began to show me exactly who they were. Before there was money, luxury stores, or managers apologizing, there was a woman very different from the one who walked into that store that day. And yet, at the same time, exactly the same. I wasn't born surrounded by comfort. I was born surrounded by need. My childhood was marked by difficult choices that no child should ever have to understand. I learned early on to calculate the price of things, not because someone taught me math, but because every expense needed to make sense. New clothes were only bought when the old ones were completely worn out. Shoes were bought with the intention of lasting for years, not of matching anything. From a young age, I understood something that has shaped who I am to this day. Appearance never guaranteed dignity. Survival, yes. I started working early, very early. I worked in silence, without applause, without recognition. I did a little bit of everything. I cleaned, organized, served, endured humiliations that many people today wouldn't even be able to hear about. I've been ignored at counters. I've been treated as invisible. I've heard snide comments about my clothes, my mannerisms, my workplace. And each of these situations left a mark. It wasn't just the financial difficulties that shaped me. It was the small, daily, almost invisible humiliations. The ones that weren't reported, but that corroded me from the inside. I remember once, many years ago, walking into a simple store, not even a luxury one, and hearing the saleswoman whisper to another, "That one's just looking." At the time, I was really just browsing, not because I didn't want to buy, but because I needed to choose carefully. I left there with the feeling that my money, whether little or much, never seemed enough when it came from someone like me. These experiences taught me something profound. When you are treated as less, it's not about what you have, it's about what they think you deserve. The money came later, much later. It came with tireless work, difficult choices, sleepless nights, calculated risks. It came without fanfare, without headlines, without a sudden change in personality. I didn't become a different person when I started earning well. I simply stopped living in constant fear of running out of money. But the scar remained. Even after achieving stability, I never managed to see myself as someone important. Not in the social sense. Not in the sense that people usually use to define value. I remained the simple woman who learned to protect herself by not drawing attention to herself. I've never liked showing off. I've never liked flashy brands, extravagant jewelry, or clothes that announce status. To me, that always sounded like a language that isn't mine. I feel safe being discreet. I feel free when no one expects anything from me. And deep down, there's another reason too. I know exactly how people treat those they think have nothing. I've been on that side, and I've never forgotten. Money changed my practical life, but it didn't erase my emotional memory. It didn't make me forget who I was or how I was treated. On the contrary, it only made a harsh truth more evident. Many people confuse human value with appearance. That's why, when I go into places like that, I observe, not to get revenge, not to humiliate anyone afterward, but to understand. Understanding those who only smile at people who seem important. Those who offer conditional respect. Those who judge people with their eyes before listening to their voice. That day, in that store, I wasn't just making a purchase. I was silently revisiting all the versions of myself that had been ignored before. And each cold gesture, each sideways glance, each rushed service, it didn't hurt because I needed them. It hurt because I recognized that pattern. I learned early on that looks open doors. But character, that's what decides whether those doors should even be open. And it was with all that baggage of someone who has been invisible, humiliated, and learned to survive without applause that I continued to observe, in silence, every detail of that service. Because, for me, that wasn't just a store. It was more of a test. My way of life hasn't changed much. Even after the money came in, I still wake up early, take care of my things on my own, do regular shopping, travel without a driver, without security, without advertising. It's not rehearsed humility. It's identity. I feel more like myself when nobody is watching me too closely. My routine is simple because I like it that way. Comfortable, neutral clothes, without flashy brands. Flat shoes. A practical bag. Nothing that screams status. To many people, this seems sloppy. To me, it's freedom. It's being able to come and go from places without having to explain who I am. And there's something deeper to all of this. I like to see how people act when they think they don't need to impress. That day, I had a clear objective. It wasn't a stroll. It wasn't curiosity. I needed to buy a specific expensive item, something I had been planning for months. I knew exactly what I wanted, how much it cost, and why I needed it. It wasn't an impulse. It was a decision. I entered the store with calm steps, as I always do. The atmosphere was impeccable. Well-lit windows, the scent of expensive perfume in the air, soft music, customers being addressed by name. Everything very beautiful. Everything very rehearsed. As soon as I stepped through the door, I felt the first glance. It wasn't aggressive. It was quick. A gaze that measures, evaluates, classifies. I've known that gaze since I was young. I kept walking, observing. I saw attendants smiling openly at well-dressed couples, at women with expensive handbags, at men in suits. Hearty laughter, immediate attention, kind offers. For me, it was different. Nobody came right away. Nobody asked if I needed help. Nobody truly smiled. A clerk walked past me twice, pretending to organize something. Another looked away when our eyes almost met. I stood there, looking at a piece, touching the material, calmly analyzing it. I knew I was visible, but I also knew that for them, I wasn't a priority. And I did nothing. I didn't clear my throat. I didn't call anyone. I didn't force my presence. Because that wasn't just a purchase. It was an observation. Eventually, an attendant approached. Not with enthusiasm, not with interest. It was almost out of obligation. The voice was correct, but cold. The words measured. Nothing technically wrong, but everything emotionally distant. "Can I help you?" he said, without looking me in the eye for very long. I explained what I was looking for. I spoke clearly, knowledgeably. I showed that I knew the product, the options, the differences. Even so, I felt something change in the air, a slight unease, as if my words didn't match my appearance. He answered briefly. He indicated something quickly. He didn't elaborate. He didn't suggest anything. He didn't insist. Meanwhile, on the other side of the store, I saw the contrast. Another customer was receiving undivided attention. Coffee offered, detailed explanations, broad smiles, everything happening at the same time, in the same space. That stirred something within me. Not because I needed validation, but because that scene awakened old memories. Memories of when I would enter places afraid to ask the price. Of when I would pretend I didn't want something so I wouldn't hear that it was too expensive. Of when I felt ashamed to exist in certain environments. I took a deep breath, not to calm myself down, but to avoid reacting. There, I consciously decided I wasn't going to confront anyone. I wasn't going to ask for better treatment. I wasn't going to reveal anything. I needed to see how far this would go. I spent more time in the store. I observed every interaction. I noticed how the tone changed depending on who was in charge. How the sales assistants' bodies leaned more towards some and closed off towards others. How certain customers were treated as an investment and others as a waste of time. And I understood something very clearly. That wasn't just a bad day. It was a pattern. When I finally got back to speak to the operator, I asked a simple, straightforward question. The answer came quickly, almost impatiently, as if I were delaying something more important. At that moment, something was confirmed within me. It wasn't unpreparedness. It wasn't shyness. It was judgment. And curiously, I didn't feel anger. I felt a kind of mature sadness. The kind that doesn't shout, but teaches. I knew I could end it right there. All it would take was a name, a card, a phone call. But it wasn't the right time yet. I needed to understand everything first. I needed to be sure I wasn't exaggerating, projecting, or misinterpreting. I stayed a little longer. I observed more. And each new detail reinforced the same pattern. It was there in silence that I decided not to react at that moment. Because, for me, reacting without fully understanding is a waste of energy. And I had already learned, throughout my life, that some answers only make sense when they come at the right time. I left that inner space of the store with my decision made. I still didn't know how it would end, but I knew exactly why I needed to see it through to the end. Because it wasn't just about me. It was about how that place treated anyone they deemed unworthy of respect. And that's something I can no longer ignore. The service worsened in an almost imperceptible way, and perhaps for that very reason, it was more painful. Nothing explicit, no offensive words, no blatant gestures. Everything was done on the edge of what was acceptable. And that, I learned early on, is where prejudice hides most easily. When I finally asked to see the item I had come to pick up, the clerk took a deep breath before answering. It wasn't physical exhaustion. It was impatience. That kind of sigh that says it all without words. This is going to be a lot of work. He brought the item carelessly. He placed it on the counter as if handing over something without emotional value. He didn't explain any details. He didn't talk about the brand's history. He didn't mention any unique selling points. Nothing like what I had just seen him do, with almost theatrical enthusiasm for other customers. I touched the material carefully. I observed the seams, the finishes, the texture. I asked technical questions that someone too simple wouldn't ask. And yet, his gaze remained the same. Distant, suspicious, assessing. That started to reopen something old inside me. A feeling I've known since before money. The feeling of needing to prove that you deserve to be somewhere. For a moment, my body reacted before my mind. My stomach clenched. My shoulders tensed. That old urge to shrink back, to finish quickly, to leave so as not to bother anyone. But I didn't leave. I was left. Because that moment wasn't just about that store. It was about everything I had experienced before being able to go anywhere without fear of the price. Meanwhile, I noticed small details around me. An attendant passed by offering water to another customer, not to me. A saleswoman approached a couple who had just entered, smiling, completely ignoring my presence beside them. I was there, visible, but invisible at the same time. At one point, the attendant made a comment that to anyone else might have seemed neutral, but to me, it sounded like confirmation. This model tends to interest those who are already familiar with the brand more, he said, with a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. I knew him. I knew him better than he imagined. But I remained silent. At that moment, I understood something with almost painful clarity. It wasn't about convincing me to buy. It was about discouraging me. It was as if, subconsciously, he was trying to spare me future embarrassment. As if he were saying, without saying it, this might not be for you. And that hurt. It hurt because I've been on the other side of that phrase. When I really couldn't. When I went into stores just to look. When I pretended I didn't like something so I wouldn't have to hear the price. Money changed my reality, but it didn't erase the memory. And there, in that quiet and elegant shop, the memory screamed. Even so, I remained calm. I took a deep breath. I maintained my composure because I needed to be absolutely sure. I spent a few more minutes there. I observed new interactions. The pattern repeated itself with almost mathematical precision. Those who appeared to have money received time, attention, and respect. Those who didn't appear to received the bare minimum necessary to avoid generating complaints. That wasn't an individual mistake. It was cultural. And it was at that point that something changed inside me. It was no longer resentment. It was clarity. I understood that I didn't need to prove anything at that moment. Neither react nor correct anything. I just needed to let it go as far as it could go. When I thanked him and said I was still deciding, the attendant nodded quickly, almost relieved, as if he were happy not to have to continue with that service. He walked away without looking back, and I stood there alone, surrounded by luxury and an old feeling of exclusion that money, on its own, could never buy. It was at that moment that I made the final decision. Not on impulse, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I knew exactly what I would do next. And I knew that when I did it, it wouldn't be to humiliate anyone. It would be to reveal something much bigger. Because, at that moment, it was already clear to me. It wasn't lack of preparation. It wasn't a bad day. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a trial. And this needed to be exposed with dignity. When I left the store, I didn't go away immediately. I stood outside for a few seconds, feeling the air on my face as if I were waking up from a place too old to still hurt like that. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry either. I was small on the inside, and that bothered me more than any bad service, because I knew exactly who I was. I knew what I had built. I knew the path I had taken to get there. And yet, a few sideways glances and a few poorly chosen words were enough to activate a version of myself that I thought I had already overcome. The woman who feels out of place. The woman who enters in silence and leaves apologizing simply for existing. I walked slowly along the sidewalk, trying to understand why it still had such power over me. Why, after everything, could that situation still touch such a sensitive place? The answer came quickly and it hurt. Because money changed my bank account. But it didn't erase the memory of who I was when I had nothing. As I walked, I remembered old situations. Shops I went into just to look and heard giggles. Salespeople who spoke to me looking over their shoulder. Times when I feigned disinterest because I knew I couldn't afford it. I thought I had left all that in the past. But the truth is, the scar was still there, quiet, dormant, waiting for a trigger. And that interaction was the trigger. What bothered me most wasn't the contempt itself. It was realizing that it wasn't personal. It wasn't directed at me. It was through the image I was conveying. I started observing the people around me. Other women were entering the store, well-dressed, made up, carrying eye-catching bags. The treatment was different. Broad smiles, bodies leaning forward, time generously offered. That's when it finally clicked. It wasn't an unprepared employee. It was standard practice. And that brought a strange feeling. While it hurt, it also gave me a cold clarity. I hadn't been rejected as a person. I had been rejected because of my appearance. And that said much more about them than about me. Even so, the feeling of invisibility followed me for a few blocks. It wasn't shame. It was something deeper. It was the discomfort of realizing that, even after winning so many battles, I still had to deal with judgments that had nothing to do with who I am. I stopped in front of a random shop window and looked at my reflection in the glass. Simple clothes, comfortable shoes, discreet bag. I recognized myself there. That woman was me, and I liked her. It was at that moment that I understood something important. The problem wasn't that I dressed simply. The problem was a world that associates human value with packaging. I started thinking about the clerk again, about how he avoided eye contact, about his haste to end the conversation with me, about how relieved he seemed when I said I was still deciding. That wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a trained, learned, normalized behavior. And that's when something inside me started to organize itself. The pain began to give way to decision. I could just walk away, buy it somewhere else, pretend nothing happened. But I knew that if I did that, that pattern would still remain intact. With me, with other people, with anyone. I went in there wearing something that didn't match the expected profile. I didn't want revenge. I never did. I wanted awareness. I wanted them to know exactly what they were doing and for whom they were doing it. As I walked back, my heart was no longer heavy. It was steady. I didn't need to prove I had money. That was irrelevant. What I needed was to expose a cruel logic that goes unnoticed because it is too silent to cause a scandal. That day, I understood a truth that I carry with me to this day. The most dangerous prejudice is not the one that shouts. It's the one that disguises itself as politeness. And there, on that way back, I decided that I wouldn't let that experience end in silence. Not out of pride, not out of vanity, but because respect cannot depend on appearance. And I was ready to show it with the same calmness with which I was judged. The next step was already clear in my mind. And when I returned to that store, it wouldn't be to buy just one product. It would confirm, without a doubt, everything I had already understood. I went back to the store the same day. I didn't change my clothes. I didn't fix my hair. I didn't put on jewelry, an expensive watch, or anything that would announce who I was. I needed everything to be exactly as it was before. I entered with the same calm posture, the same tranquil step. The attendant recognized me and looked away for a second, as if expecting the person to just leave. This time, I wasn't ignored. I was seen promptly. "Have you decided yet?" he asked without a smile, without enthusiasm. I walked slowly to the most expensive item in the store. I touched the fabric carefully. I looked at the price tag. I took a deep breath. "I want that," I said. He raised his eyebrows, surprised. He tried to hide it, but his body gave him away. His voice came out differently. Of course, he replied, swallowing hard. We went to the cashier. The silence there was thick. There was no more disdain, but there was no respect either. There was distrust. When I asked to pay in installments for the maximum amount allowed, he almost smiled, a quick, automatic smile, like someone who believes they've confirmed a prejudice. "Document, please." I handed it in. He typed my name. He stopped. He typed it again. He stared at the screen for too long. His body changed. He called the manager over with a discreet but urgent gesture. The manager came rushing over, with that trained demeanor of someone who handles delicate situations. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "None," I replied, before the attendant could say anything. "I just wanted to confirm that everything is all right." The manager read the name on the screen. He looked up. He blinked twice. The silence that fell there wasn't awkward. It was revealing. "Madam," he began, adjusting his jacket. "We didn't know that." I interrupted him calmly. "I know. You didn't know." I looked around. Other customers were discreetly watching. Employees pretended to organize clothing racks, but they were listening to everything. "I didn't come here to be recognized," I continued. "I came to buy, and before that, to understand how you treat someone who doesn't seem like the type of customer you expect." The manager took a deep breath. The clerk was pale. "Yesterday," I said, looking directly at him, "I was ignored, treated hastily, as if I were getting in the way. Today, the attitude has changed only because you've discovered who I am." The manager tried to justify himself. "That wasn't our intention." "Yes, it was," I replied, without raising my voice. "Intention doesn't need to be conscious to exist. It appears in the gesture, in the look, in the time you offer or deny." The entire store seemed suspended in midair. "I didn't need to prove I had money," I continued. "I just wanted to know how you treat those you think don't have it." The manager lowered his head. The clerk couldn't look me in the eye. "I apologize," he said. "On behalf of the store," I nodded. "Not out of acceptance. Out of closure." "Apologies don't erase patterns," I replied, "but they can be the start of change, if they come with awareness." I looked again at the piece I had chosen. I thought for a few seconds. "I'll take it," I said, not because I needed to, but because that choice was now mine and not a reaction. While they were finalizing the purchase, I noticed something curious. The service was impeccable, kind, attentive. Too late. When I left the store, I felt something different than I expected. It wasn't victory. It wasn't satisfaction. It was peaceful. I hadn't proven anything to them. I had confirmed something for myself. That simple woman who went in there was the same one who came out. The difference was that now I knew, with absolute clarity, that dignity cannot be bought, but it can be demanded simply by the act of existing. I left the store walking slowly, not out of exhaustion, but because something inside me was reorganizing itself. It was as if an old part of my history had finally found a place to rest. For years, I told myself that it didn't affect me anymore, that the money had solved it, that the past was behind me. But the truth is that every sideways glance, every cold service, every silent judgment reopened the same old wound. Not the wound of poverty, but the wound of invisibility. That day, I didn't confront anyone to prove my power. I didn't humiliate anyone who tried to belittle me. I didn't raise my voice. I just observed, and I chose. I chose not to react with anger. I chose not to buy respect with money. I chose not to be ashamed of who I am or who I was. When I got home, I took off my shoes, sat on the sofa, and remained silent for a few minutes. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pick up my cell phone. I needed to experience it completely. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to defend myself from the past. I was at peace with it. The girl who entered that store dressed simply was the same one who worked hard, who was ignored, who learned to survive without asking anything from anyone. And the woman who left was someone who finally understood that she didn't need to change herself to be respected. In the following days, I thought a lot about consumption, about choices, about where I put my money and, above all, my energy. I realized it wasn't about luxury stores. It was about environments, about places where someone's worth depends on their appearance, about relationships where treatment changes according to what you appear to have. I started, little by little, to change small things. I started leaving places where I needed to prove myself. I only stayed where my presence, simple or sophisticated, was enough. I also started speaking up more, not to accuse, but to warn. I told my story to friends, to younger women, to people who still believe they need to look like something in order to be treated with respect. And he always said the same thing: money can open doors, but character is what defines how someone receives you when you enter. Interestingly, after that episode, I stopped feeling the need to hide my story, not out of pride, but out of reconciliation. I no longer needed to prove that I had won. My journey spoke for itself, and most importantly, I no longer wanted to be treated well only when I seemed important. I wanted to be treated with humanity. Always, in that store, I didn't waste time. I gained clarity. Clarity that some experiences don't exist to diminish us, they exist to remind us of who we are. Today, when I dress simply, it's not a strategy. It's a matter of consistency. Because that simple woman is still me. And now, more than ever, I know exactly how much she's worth. I learned something that no bank account, no black card, and no millionaire balance could teach me before. People don't reveal who you are. They reveal who they are. That day, I didn't go into a store to buy a product. I went in to confirm a truth that had been with me since very early on. Respect that comes from appearances is fragile. And what is fragile was never true respect. For a long time, I thought I needed to get there to stop being invisible. That money would erase the looks of contempt. That achievement would change the way the world saw me. But what I discovered was different and harder. Money changes the scenery, but it doesn't change the heart of the one who judges. If someone only treats you well when they think you have something to offer, that person was never interested in you. And this applies to everything: relationships, work, family, friendships, environments. How many times do we diminish ourselves trying to fit into a place that was never meant to respect us? How many times do we change our clothes, our posture, the way we speak, just to avoid being discarded? I experienced both sides of it, when I had little, and when I came to have a lot. And do you know what changed? Nothing that really matters. The woman who walked into that simple shop was the same one who walked out a millionaire, with the same history, with the same scars, with the same dignity. And that's what set me free. Because when you understand that you don't need to prove your worth to those who have already decided to judge you, you become unreachable. Today, I choose where I enter, but more than that, I choose where I stay. I choose environments where kindness doesn't depend on appearance, where good morning doesn't change depending on the shoes you wear, where the gaze is human before it's judgmental. And if somewhere doesn't see me that way, I simply move on. No anger, no speeches, no need to prove anything. Because dignity cannot be bought, and respect cannot be begged for. If this story touched you, perhaps it's not because of the store, the money, or the luxury. Perhaps it's because, at some point in your life, you too have been judged by your appearance. Perhaps you've already been ignored. Perhaps you've already been treated differently. Perhaps you've already felt that silent sensation of I don't belong. If this has happened to you, I want to tell you something important. The problem was never you. It was never the clothes. It was never the manner. It was never what you had or didn't have. The problem has always been the perspective of those who confuse value with status. Therefore, I leave you with a few questions not to answer here, but to take with you. Have you ever been treated differently for seeming too simple? Have you ever felt like you needed to prove something just to be respected? And most importantly, are you still trying to fit in where you're not seen? If the answer is yes, perhaps it's time to do as I did that day. Stop explaining and start choosing. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. And if you want to keep hearing stories that don't romanticize appearance, money, or status but speak of real scars, follow the channel. Here, we don't judge people by what they wear. We listen to what they carry within them.